So, distributed version control. This isn't an exclusive feature of Git. There are other distributed version control systems around, but Git is by far the most popular, and also the one that made this way of working mainstream, so to say. So most people identify distributed version control with Git. Let's see what Sanya has been up to. She just moved to another project in the same company, and this other project uses Git. What does she do differently this time? The first difference between working with Subversion and working with Git comes immediately the moment that Sanya connects to the project's repository, in that she doesn't just connect to the repository, instead she does something called a clone. There is a git clone command for that, and what that means is that Sanya copies the entire repository to her machine. All of it, project history and all, including of course the latest commits, that is, the current files in the project. In fact, if you want to see the repository of a Git project, you usually don't have to look very far. Here is that project from the demo I gave you earlier on. Back then I told you not to worry about the repository, that it was somewhere. As it turns out, it was right under our noses. If I give this command, that on my operating system means show me the content of this directory, including the hidden files and directories, you see that there is a hidden directory here called .git. And this directory contains the Git repository, including the entire history of the project. So, more often than not, a project's Git repository is right there inside the project directory. So now that Sanya has her own repo, she can do anything she wants on it. She can create commits, branches, check out earlier versions of the project, anything she wants. And at some point, she'll probably want to synchronize her changes with the changes from the rest of her team. How does that work in a distributed Git project? What happens is that even though she has her own repo, Sanya maintains a link to the shared repo. That's called a remote in Git's terminology. And she has additional commands to get the latest commits from the remote repo to the local repo. That's called a pull. Or the other way around. That's called a push. And just like happens in client-server version control, Sanya might have to solve conflicts during these operations. In that case, she'll do a pull first to get all the shared changes, then merge those changes with her local changes, and finally push her local changes to the shared team repo. Just to be clear, even if the team has a shared repo, that doesn't mean that Sanya's repo is a second-class citizen. A Git environment is a peer-to-peer system, where there are usually multiple repositories that are all technically equally good. Except that, of course, there are conventions, and most teams agree by convention that there is a copy of this repo on a shared server, and that's the important one, that is visible to the entire team. And Sanya's own copy is less important, and maybe it doesn't get shared to other developers. But otherwise, there are just multiple copies of the same project history. In theory, you might not even have a shared server. You might just have a network of developers' repositories that are each other's remotes, without any server that's officially the central repo. I've never seen people do that in practice, but it could be done. So that's the idea of distributed version control. This idea of having multiple repos that are essentially peers, and sometimes are connected as each other's remotes. And when I learned Git for the first time, I was a bit confused. I was like, okay, so I get the idea, but how is that better than just having one central repo? Doesn't it just make things more complicated? And it took me some time to understand the advantages of distributed version control. One of those advantages is pretty clear. That is, if Sanya has her own repo, she can still work with version control even when she disconnects from the central server. She cannot share code with the rest of the team, but she can still create commits, check out branches, move back and forth in history, and so on. That's a nice feature. It plays well with remote working, and it also removes the single point of failure that is the central repository. But I would say that the greatest benefit of distributed version control goes above and beyond this idea of working while disconnected from the remote server. It's a benefit that is at the same time more subtle and more powerful. And it's all about the flexibility to work in ways that are different from the traditional workflow of client-server development. Sometimes a bit different, sometimes radically different. In the next and last module of this training, you'll see what I mean by that. We'll talk about the workflow used by most open source projects today that would be simply impossible with client-server version control. But before we move into that, let's close this module with a few reasons not to use Git.